Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some of the biggest surprises and disappointments for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. Now, when it comes to a hockey team, there are a lot of moving parts. You got 12 forwards, 6 defensemen, 2 goaltenders, then you got the 13th and the 14th forward, all the minor league forwards, the 7th and 8th defensemen, and all the minor league defensemen, as well as the backup goaltender, and then, of course, all the systems like the head coach and the power play and the penalty kill. So there's a lot that can go right for a team in a season, but there's also a lot that can go wrong, and for most teams you're kind of just trying to have as much go right as possible and as little go wrong, though you're probably going to end up with both anyhow. And for the Sharks, that is exactly what has happened this season. No surprise there. So let's talk about some of the biggest surprises and some of the biggest disappointments. First surprise on the year would of course be Teemo Meyer. After a fantastic 18-19 campaign where he had a career year, he ends up at the end of his entry-level deal. The Sharks signed him to a $6 million contract for 4 years. It's looking like an absolute steal of a contract because of the statistics and the underlying statistics that he put up in that 18-19 season. And yet in 19-20 and 2021, there was a massive regression for Teemo Meyer to the point that in the 2021 season, he ended up with just 12 goals, which would have put him on pace for less than 20 in a full 82-game season. He already has more than 20 thus far this season, and he's only played about half of the year. So clearly, Teemo Meyer had some issues over those past 2 years, but this year, he's absolutely rebounded. He has not only looked just as good as he did in those 3 years ago, but he looks even better. He's been driving his own lines. He's been consistently the Sharks' best player for almost every single night, I would say. The Sharks have played, 46 games at this point, and I would bet, obviously this is not an exact number, that he's been their best player for at least 30 to 35 of those games, which is extremely impressive. He's scored 5 goals in one game, which is already saying a lot for any player, because you can't really say that about most players in the NHL at this point. It's a big rarity, and yet he managed to do so. He's over a point per game. He would be on pace in a full season if he, of course, didn't get injured or was out with COVID or whatever. He'd be on pace for over 90 points, over 40 goals. Extremely impressive season thus far from Teemo Meyer, and he definitely has been the biggest surprise when you compare it to those past couple of seasons. And if I were giving grades at this point, I've in the past given grades to players, usually at the end of seasons. I have never given the grade of an A+ to anybody. I've always said, there's that next level that they can reach. This season, if I were giving a grade at the very least right now, I would give Teemo Meyer an A+. On to the first disappointment I have, and kind of a player who somewhat mirrored Teemo Meyer, would actually be Kevin Lebanc, because he also had a career year in that 18-19 season, playing on a third line with Joe Thornton and Marcus Sorensen, and also being a very important part of the first power play unit for the San Jose Sharks. You only have to watch that Game 7 versus the Vegas Golden Knights to see just how important he was as a piece on that first power play unit. And yet, like Teemo Meyer, he also had that 19-20 season and 2021 season where he regressed significantly, but unlike Meyer, he hasn't really rebounded at all this year. He had opportunities in the top 6 that he never really ran with. He had games in the bottom 6 where he just didn't do much of anything, and currently Kevin Lebanc is on the sidelines with an injury, but honestly, this is probably a reminder to many Sharks fans watching this that Kevin Lebanc is indeed still on the team and is in fact injured, because he was so ineffective earlier on that you barely notice that there's even any difference with him out of the lineup. And so while Teemo Meyer really just jumped at the occasion this season and has really rebounded, Kevin Lebanc has done nowhere near the same thing. So suddenly, Meyer's contract looking like an absolute steal, but when it comes to Kevin Lebanc's contract, who was given a contract at the end of the 19-20 season as basically a thank you after he took just a massive discount at the end of the 18-19 season, $1 million for 1 year, now suddenly this Kevin Lebanc contract is an absolute anchor, pretty much unmovable, I would say, as he still has 2 years left after this one, and you can only really hope that he does pull a Teemo Meyer over these next couple of seasons, because right now, it looks like he is sorely missing the presence of a player like Joe Thornton, which he had on his line all those years ago. On to the surprises once again, we have Erik Carlson here as the second player. it's kind of a theme here that to talk about that 18-19 season. Erik Karlsson, that was his first year as a San Jose Sharks. At first, his underlying numbers were looking very good, but the eye test was looking very bad. However, by the time December rolled around that season, the underlying statistics finally began to match up with the eye test. He was looking like an absolute world beater. A month and a half where he looked like the Sharks' best player by far, but he ended up getting injured about halfway through January, tried to come back at a point, didn't look particularly good, but eventually would return for the playoffs for the Sharks, and even while playing injured, still looked like a very good player, was still putting up a ton of points, and as such, he ended up earning a massive contract of $11.5 million. Likely an overpay, even with how good he looked in that 18-19 season, but with the 19-20 and 2021 years that followed, he looked like the worst contract in the league, I would say. He was playing at maybe half of the value of his contract at best at times, and I would say even lower than that at times, because he was really looking completely lost, not just offensively, or not just defensively, which is to be somewhat expected, I guess, but also offensively, which was the completely unexpected part. But this season, he has had a massive rebound. The underlying statistics are suddenly looking extremely strong and making him look like one of the best defensemen in the NHL currently. Of course, now that he's injured, it is a bit of a disappointment, and so there's not going to be any sort of potential dark horse Norris run. I doubt that was going to happen, but he was certainly up there in maybe the top 15 defensemen in the NHL currently. The offensive numbers weren't necessarily following behind him, but can you really blame him? Not to rag on the Sharks offensively, but past Teemo Meyer and Tomas Hertl, the Sharks don't necessarily have a ton of offensive firepower when you compare to a team like the Tampa Bay Lightning and Victor Hedman. He's got Braden Point, Steven Stamkos, Nikita Kucherov to pass to, or you compare to a player like Cale Makar, who has Nathan McKinnon, Gabriel Landeskog, or Mikko Rantanen to pass to. Erik Karlsson has a bit less to work with, and yet he was a massive driving force for the Sharks offense, at least when he was healthy, right up there with players like Meyer and Hertl. He was doing a lot of good things on the back end for the Sharks, and even defensively, that really became the main question each and every night. It was not whether or not Carlson would look good offensively, because that was just expected at this point, but defensively, it was a question, how good would he look? And more often than not, he was actually putting up some pretty respectable defensive games, and so generally a massive rebound and a huge surprise for Carlson this season. On to the second disappointment. It is not just a specific player, but a group of players, and that would have to do with the Sharks' fourth line. The major message coming into the season from Doug Wilson was that he picked up a bunch of these fourth line type of players and was saying that he expects to have competition for that fourth line. He wants players to be competitive so that it goes to improving everybody who is trying to earn a lineup spot. Well, that didn't end up working out. We have players like Jasper Weatherby, Lane Peterson, Yona Gadovic, Jeff Viel, who are consistently earning roster spots night in, night out, who are doing essentially nothing with those opportunities. I don't think Lane Peterson has a goal yet. Jasper Weatherby, I don't even know if he has, 5 points on the season. He might have that, but it's the fact that that's even a question is pretty disappointing. Yona Gadovic was picked up off of waivers from the Vancouver Canucks, and I remember all the Canucks fans were saying, oh, wow, what a terrible wave. I can't believe Jim Benning would do such a thing. The Sharks got so lucky here. And Gadovic was supposed to be this player who was, managed to be a goal scorer at every single level that he played at. Well, turns out the NHL is a much more difficult level than every other level in the entire world, and Gadovic is nowhere near anything impressive at all. He's a player who I would, not be disappointed to never see play again here, at least this season, at the very least for the Sharks. And Jeff Viel, he has a couple of goals. Both of them are extremely lucky and is not really a super effective player for the San Jose Sharks, and yet they continue to get game after game, and they're just not doing anything. At this point, you come to the end of a game and you say, okay, the Sharks' first line is worth talking about. They're usually pretty strong offensively. The second line is sometimes on, sometimes off. The third line is usually rather hit or miss. They either have a very good game or a very bad game. But the fourth line is just so useless, to use a pretty harsh adjective, that it's almost worth just completely skipping over them, because you know that there's nothing to expect out of the players who come in onto that fourth line, and that makes them one of the biggest disappointments for me. Now, of course, the fourth line doesn't usually play a massive role on a team, which is why it's not the worst thing in the world that this fourth line isn't doing anything, but still, and you compare it to the fact that the Sharks were supposed to have this competition, they were supposed to have a competent fourth line, and the fact that they've come in with essentially nothing at this point is very disappointing. Now on to the surprise side. With the last surprise of the season, we do have, of course, Jacob Middleton, a player who had played a sort of scattered amount of games over these past 3 seasons, hadn't played a ton, but played a decent amount, and it felt as though that every single game he played, he was an outright liability. He wasn't just, not doing anything, some sort of 7th defenseman, very forgettable. He was not forgettable because he was that much of an active liability for the San Jose Sharks in most of the games that he played. And so at the beginning of this season, when I heard that Middleton would end up on a pairing with Erik Carlson because of the injury to Nikolai Knyzhov, I was extremely worried that you were putting a player like Carlson, who had been very spotty over the past couple of seasons, with a player like Jacob Middleton, who had been very awful these past couple of seasons. And yet this has ended up as one of the better Sharks pairings, if not the best Sharks pairings this season. Obviously, I already talked about Erik Carlson, but Jacob Middleton has to be given at the very least a bit of credit to how Erik Carlson has really managed to rebound thus far this season. If you had told me at the beginning of the year that Middleton was going to end up being not only a top 4 defenseman, but an actual solid top 4 defenseman for the Sharks, I would have never believed you. But his defensive game looks absolutely night and day from where he was over these past couple of seasons when he played those very, very scattered games. I don't know if it's the more ice time. I don't know if something changed this past offseason, but he looks like an entirely different player, and it's been very nice to see. It'll be interesting to see what actually happens when Knyzhov does return to the lineup, if that ever actually happens at this point this season. It seems as though Knyzhov has had a ton of setbacks, but right now it'll be very difficult to justify moving Middleton out of that lineup spot with Erik Carlson, though I guess at this point he's not really playing with Carlson anymore. And finally, on to the last disappointment. We actually have not a player, not a group of players, but a head coach. Bob Booner has been rather disappointing for me this season. I've already talked about in the past, not just this year, but in previous years, that me and Bob Booner have not necessarily always seen eye to eye, but this season there have been a couple of things that I have been disappointed with, and this actually relates to the second disappointment on this list, which was the 4th line, because, I talk about how Weatherby and Peterson and Gadovic are getting all of these games and not doing anything with that, but it's not their fault that they continue to be given game after game in the lineup. That's Bob Booner's fault, who continues to, for whatever reason, rearrange the deck chairs on the sinking Titanic, or trying to move some puzzle pieces around and attempting to create the Mona Lisa when he's working with 4 puzzle pieces that look nothing like that. You're not going to get a solid 4th line with these players. That's something that needs to be understood. You would think that after 5 games, 10 games into the season for these players, that, hey, maybe this isn't actually working out. You take a look at that 18-19 season. If Lane Peterson had come in and played games like he currently is, he wouldn't have stayed in the lineup for more than a couple games under Peter DeBoer. But for whatever reason, Bob Booner, who has been consistently quite harsh in other areas of the lineup, has decided to just completely abandon the 4th line and just says, hey, you know what? Let's just dress these couple of players. Let's play them 8 to 9 minutes a night. They're not going to do anything, but then let's do that every single night after that. And I just don't understand, because this actually ties into a specific player who I do want to talk about, a player like Jaden Helbegger, who at a point was called up this season and was immediately thrust into a spot on the 2nd line with Tomas Hertl. And I was impressed that Bob Booner had decided to do that. And I really felt as though Helbegger looked quite solid in that role. And something I do want to compare it to is actually when John Leonard was thrust into a 2nd line role at the beginning of last season with Hertl and Evander Kane. And even though Leonard came right out the gate with 2 assists, it never really felt as though Leonard fit in on that 2nd line, and eventually he would get moved off of it. But that's not the case with Helbegger. I actually thought he did not look like a fish out of water on that 2nd line. Looked like he not necessarily belonged there. I didn't think it was a long-term solution, but that he was an effective offensive player and could roll on that 2nd line, at least for the foreseeable future. But after playing just 2 games there, he got an assist, his first career assist. He was dropped out of the lineup completely and would only play actually 1 other game on the year, and that would be on the 4th line, getting essentially no minutes. And if you were to ask me at this point, who would I rather have? Lane Peterson, who's played 30 games on the year and done literally nothing with it ever, or Helbegger, who has played just 3 games this season and has already done more offensively than Peterson had done in 10 times that amount of games? I would say Helbegger, and yet for whatever reason, Bob Booner is set in playing these awful pylon traffic cone type of players on the 4th line night in, night out, when a player like Helbegger, or even just other players in the minors like a Shemelevsky or a Blickfield, who you could call up and try out in these positions are just sitting in the Barracuda and getting points there. Another player who would be a good option would be Nick Merkley. I wouldn't say Merkley was as impressive in the handful of games that he played this season as Helbegger Watts would, but he still seems to be at the very least a slightly better option than Jasper Weatherby, and yet no changes actually occur. Another thing that I do want to talk about when it comes to Bob Booner is actually his management of Brent Burns. I know Brent Burns is a player who is a Sharks fan favorite, a coach favorite as well. He plays in all situations, continues to have a ton of ice time, but is it really all that smart for him to continue to get this much ice time at his age? I mean, his offensive game has regressed. His defensive game, which by the way was never all that great, has also regressed. It feels as though maybe his time on ice should also regress a bit, go down by a couple of minutes, and yet he has managed to maintain a relatively consistent rate, and if not even go up at times. And the biggest sort of example of that was not this past weekend, but a couple of weekends ago, the Sharks had a back-to-back against the Florida Panthers and the Carolina Hurricanes, 2 games within 24 hours of each other, and Brent Burns played a combined 60 plus minutes in those 2 games. You don't want to have any player in any season with any 2 games, not even back-to-back, not even 2 consecutive games, play a combined over 60 minutes, and yet Brent Burns did that with 2 back-to-back games. It's just not a good idea from a coaching perspective. Yes, Mario Ferraro was injured, but you gotta try and trust players like Marc-Edouard Vlasic slightly more. I know he's not necessarily great this season, but still, you gotta try and trust players like Ryan Merkley or Vadim Shemek a bit more in those particular areas, because I can tell you by the time minute 25, minute 30 rolled around, Brent Burns was looking like the biggest liability defensively for the Sharks on the ice. It was not looking good, and yet Bob Booner continues to send him out shift after shift after shift. I just cannot understand that. But that will do it for this. There's obviously more surprises and disappointments on the team, but these were the 3 biggest ones. If I were to point to other ones, Nick Bonino has been a bit of a disappointment, I would say, this season. You can also say Alex Barabanov has been a bit of a surprise this season, but these were the 3 biggest ones that I wanted to talk about here. Class dismissed.